This is getting started with timelines. In this first tutorial, we're going to be talking about why we use timelines and what value they can add to our research storytelling. Timelines can help us to describe and document processes that unfold over time. They can provide a historical overview of a process. They can help us make connections between events that might seem somewhat unrelated to one another. In creating a timeline, we might reveal patterns in chronological events that aren't otherwise discernible. Sometimes when we're creating a timeline, it can help us explore the causes of the events that are part of the timeline. They can help us to reflect on important and unimportant events in the process. As you create a timeline, you have to make decisions about what information somebody's going to get in your timeline and what it is that you're going to ignore. These timelines can be used to inform, educate, and entertain. These are interactive timelines. Finally, you can embed these timelines in programs like Omeka, WordPress, and elsewhere to help tell your story to your viewers. When you're thinking about creating your timeline, remember that you can use many different media types. You can use Twitter, Flickr, YouTube, Vimeo, SoundCloud, Google Maps, Wikipedia, Adobe Document Cloud. These are all available to you. A good place to begin with timelines is to create your own personal timeline. You know yourself better than probably anybody else. And so this is a good way to take your story and put it into context. The first thing you're going to want to do is plan out your story. So you want to know what story you're going to tell about yourself. We tell lots of stories about ourselves, and in this particular one, you're going to be presenting yourself in a way that you hope makes sense to the people who are viewing your timeline and who want to learn more about you. So one of the big questions is, which events do you want to reveal from your life? You can't tell everybody everything. So what are the real highlights? And what are the things that you want to leave out? There are lots of things in our lives that we don't want to share for personal reasons, or maybe because it doesn't advance the story that we're trying to tell. For instance, if I were creating a timeline of my own, I might mention that I started playing Little League Baseball at 6 years old, but does that really advance the story? You have to ask yourself, what do I want to tell people and what do they not need to know? The other thing is adding in some contextual milestones into your story. So if you have particular things that you're enthusiastic about that might help us to understand you a little bit better, and also to educate the people who are looking at your timeline by adding in elements from history or science or whatever it is that you're particularly interested in, might just give people more insight into who you are. You could begin planning your timeline using this timeline planning grid. So you can choose out your personal milestones, the things that you want people to know about you, but then also put in contextual milestones. These are things that might come from any number of sources, but they're things that help you to explain who you are and how you got to where you are, so that your story becomes more complete, put into some broader context. As you go about planning your timeline, one thing that you're going to want to do is to collect all the media that you want to use to accompany each event. And I'll remind you here, be creative and draw on as many sources as you need to and you want to be able to tell your story. But also be sure that you record and you cite your resources so that you're giving proper credit to the people who created those resources in the first place. A few things to keep in mind as you're designing your timeline and putting it together. You're going to want to keep it pretty short. Probably don't want to have more than about 20 events in your timeline. You're going to want to pick stories that have a strong chronological narrative. That is something that is developing over time. In this particular case, you're talking about your life. It's unfolding over time. In choosing the events that you're going to make part of your timeline, you're going to want to make sure that they speak to some broader narrative story that you're trying to get across to the people who are looking at your timeline. So include events that build up to major occurrences where you need to have those. Ultimately, use the types of media that are going to help you to tell that story, whether they're video, photographic, sound files, or whatever they might be.
Let's look at a completed timeline to get a sense of what a timeline is going to look like and how the spreadsheet is operating behind the timeline. So on the screen right now, you'll see my Google spreadsheet that I have created and I have published to the web. That's an important step, that publishing to the web, because if you don't do that, then the timeline program's not going to be able to find your material. So you have to make sure that you've done that you've clicked publish here, and then you can just get rid of this guy. And so you'll see the structure here. We have year, month, and day, the beginning time of the event. Then we have the end time of the event, year, month, and day. We're going to create a short headline that'll show up on the screen as a headline to the particular event. Some descriptive text. You want to sort of get some balance here, enough information that it explains what this event is, not so much that people won't want to read it. I have put in my media connection, so it's going to reach out, in this case to Flickr, to grab a photo that I've posted there. I've provided the media credit for that particular post, so where did this come from? And then there's going to be a caption below that explains that particular piece of media. There are a couple of other columns out here. One is the type, and so in this particular case, this is my title slide, so I'm just going to use that title drop down. And then what I've done here in creating my timeline is to try to use the timeline to give you a bit more of a sense about the subject of the timeline. So in this case, I've created a timeline for the first 12 years of my life. This is something that you may be doing as an exercise for a class. And I think starting with your own story makes a lot of sense because you know your story better than anybody else. So you're not going to have to be necessarily doing a lot of research about yourself. So each line is an event, and you'll notice that I have about 19 events here in the first 13 years of my life. But something else I've done over here, I've used this group column to create some layers within the timeline that I think are going to add value to telling my story. So as an individual, I have a couple of passions in my life. One of them is politics, and another one is music. So I'm going to be telling my personal story, things that happened in my life, but in order to give people a sense of when this was happening, where this was happening, I'm also going to add these other events So, for instance, on the day I was born, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States after being elected in 1964. That gives you a sense of the time in which I was born. And because I'm interested in music, I tracked down to see what the number one song was that week, thinking, hey, this is probably something that my parents were listening to in 1965. And so that creates that music layer. So as I go from personal experience to personal experience, you're going to get a sense of the context also, so that the timeline is more interesting than simply a timeline about myself. And what that also does is it gives me an opportunity to use different kinds of media. So I'm not only going to be using photos here, but I can use video, I can use sound clips, whatever it is that I want to do. So I've published this to the web. I'm going to take my URL here, take it over to the Night Labs site, put it in here at step number 3. So I'll paste that in there, hit preview, and it will show me my timeline. Now, I was talking about those layers a second ago, and here's what I mean by that, is that there are going to be these different layers. So it shows this first slide on the personal layer. This is about me. As we go through, you'll see that things will pop up for politics and for music. And so here I'm just using a photograph. This is actually in our library collections. And that gives you a sense of what I look like at about 11, 12 years old, something like that. It was the 1970s, so we wore some crazy stuff back then. So the first event I have here is a personal event. My parents got married. A few years later, they would have me. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson sworn in as president. Now see how that's appearing here on this politics line. So that's providing some information that goes beyond the simple fact that I was born in 1965. In 1965, the number one song in America was a song called Downtown by Petula Clark, a song that shows up prominently in an episode of Seinfeld if you're a Seinfeld fan. But here's what I've done here is I've been able to embed this YouTube content. So if somebody wants to go and hear Petula Clark sing her famous song, they can go and do that. And that's what makes the timeline a little bit more interesting, is that you can add these interactive features to the timeline that will further educate or entertain the people who are looking at the timeline. And so my timeline goes through with events from my life, but also events that were going on around me historically. I'm able to throw in some things that continue to provide some context. So this is a picture of Seattle's Space Needle being built for the 1962 World's Fair. And so in addition to establishing my year of birth, I'm also giving you some sense of what was going on around me at the time. And this is one of the real values of these timelines, is that they can provide more information in a more entertaining and more expansive way than perhaps a PowerPoint doing the same thing would do. So I won't go through the entire timeline, but I wanted to give you a sense of what it was exactly that you could do with these timelines in order to make them more interesting and also more informative and educational.
Thanks for taking the time to look at this overview of timelines. In subsequent tutorials, we'll be walking you through the process of creating your spreadsheet, filling it in, and then rendering the timeline.